And now it is my honor to introduce our next speaker, Kim Vu. Kim is with Bank of America, which has generously sponsored our conference today as our keynote sponsor, and which has been a staunch supporter for SJI's work over these past 3 years. Kim is the market executive for the Greater Puget Sound region and is responsible for Bank of America's local business strategy and community engagement. She is an alum of the bank's Multicultural Women's Leadership Program, aimed at investing in the advancement of high-potential women leaders of color, and currently serves on the bank's Global Diversity and Inclusion Council. Kim is also an avid volunteer in our community and nationally, working on an array of issues related to disadvantaged youth, juvenile justice, economic development, and workforce. At SJI, we are truly appreciative of Kim's enthusiasm for and real understanding of our work and what we are trying to accomplish by bringing all of you together in these conferences to raise, discuss, and address important emerging issues that impact our work and those who we serve. Please join me in welcoming Kim Vu. There you go.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Ben, for that warm introduction and also for the beautiful acknowledgement of the relationship and connection to our Native communities and land here in Seattle. At Bank of America, we're guided by the common principle to help make financial lives through the power of every connection. ESG, which is short for environmental and social governance, is embedded across our business and reflects how we fuel the global economy, build trust and credibility, and represent a company that people want to work for, invest in, and do business with. ESG guides all of our organizational principles and practices and enables us to advance economic and social progress to create shared success for our customers, our clients, our communities, and for our employees. It also demonstrates the inclusive and supportive workplace that we create for our employees, the responsible products and services that we offer, and the impact we make in helping communities thrive and all the economies in the world succeed. A key piece of this work is informing relationships and strong partnerships with nonprofits and advocacy groups, as with environmental, consumer, and community organizations like SJI, to bring together our collective networks and expertise to achieve greater impact in the Puget Sound and beyond. We thank you for allowing us to work alongside you in this work. We are proud once again to sponsor SJI's annual conference for the 3rd year, and the theme this year, Equity by Design. We're thrilled to have Dr. Virginia Eubanks with us, a professor at University of Albany and author of Automating Inequality, to open up our conversation today and help us as practitioners consciously think about how bias shows up in program design. Dr. Eubanks' research takes a deep dive into investigating the serious implications of data mining, policy algorithms, and predictive risk models that are applied to poor and working class Americans, and illustrates the impact of what happens when decision makers place higher value on designing for efficiency rather than designing for equity. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Eubanks.
Oh, you left me the chimes. So there might be a musical interlude. If I feel like you guys are looking like your energy is flagging, I might just do a jam up here and see how that works. Hi, good morning. How's everybody doing? Good. Oh, what a friendly crowd. That's really exciting. Thank you so much for welcoming me to Seattle. I especially want to thank SJI, everyone, really too many people to name who got me here, made sure I knew where I was going, put together this incredible conference, and honored me with the invitation to come speak to you all. And I'm here to propose that while new sort of data-driven technology and social services has the potential to lower barriers, has the potential to speed results, what we're actually doing is building what I call in the book a digital poorhouse, which is an invisible institution made up of these decision-making algorithms, automated eligibility processes, statistical models in social services. And so I want to talk today a bit about how the rise of this thing that I call the digital poorhouse responds to and recreates a narrative of austerity, this idea that we don't have enough for everyone, and that we have to make hard decisions about who deserves to attain their basic human rights. So that's kind of the framework that we'll be engaging with today. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open by introducing you to a little bit of history that's important to understand around how we got to social policy around poverty and economic inequality that we have in the United States today. And then I'm going to introduce you to some families who really took enormous risks agreeing to go on the record in my book. So most of them are currently in the public service system, are potentially involved with the child welfare system, or who are currently unhoused. They took really extraordinary risks, sharing their experiences with me to share with a reading audience. And so I try to make sure always to ground the talks and conversations I have in their experience. So we'll talk a bit about some families, and we'll use that as a way to talk about the different systems I profile in the book. Then I'll raise just a couple of big ideas, like what do I see happening across these different cases? And then we'll have some time, I hope, to talk about potential solutions and sort of ways to reframe before we move into the panel conversation. So though we like to talk about our sort of sexiest, newest technologies as disruptors, the digital, already there's doubt on the disruptors language. So I'm already, I know which path to go down with this audience by what you laugh at. So the digital tools that we find in social services specifically are really more evolution than revolution. And their roots actually go really, really far back in our history, at least till the 1820s. And I was making a joke with my co-panelists earlier about the book, Automating Inequality, originally had, the first chapter was a 90-page chapter of history. Because I'm really, really like to go into the weeds of historical detail, which I'm not going to do with you today, I swear. But at this point, I generally thank my editor for catching what would have been, I think, a fascinating chapter, but maybe not the most popular first chapter of my book. It's now a svelte 25 pages. So I write quite a lot of history in the book, but I'm just going to talk about one moment in that history today. And that is after there was a huge depression in the United States in the 1919, a huge economic dislocation. And economic elites got really nervous, both because of the rise of economic inequality and also because of some very fearless organizing among poor and working class people who were protecting their families and their rights. So they did what economic elites often did, was commission a series of studies. And the questions that the studies asked was, what's the real cause of economic suffering? Is it poverty? Is it a lack of resources? Or is it what they called at the time pauperism, which is dependence on public benefits? So does anyone want to guess the conclusions of the studies, whether it was the problem was poverty, lack of resources, or dependence, pauperism? Pauperism, yes, okay, that's right. And so their solution to since the problem wasn't poverty, the problem was dependence on public benefits. The solution to that problem was to build a system of county poorhouses across the country that required everyone who was requesting access to public aid to enter into the institution of the poorhouse in exchange for those services. And that was no easy choice for most folks, because entering the poorhouse required that if you had these rights at the time, remember this is the 1820s, that you had to give up your right to vote and hold office, you had to give up your right to marry, And if you had children, they were often removed from you upon entering the poorhouse because it was believed that poor children could be rehabilitated by having access to wealthier families. And by access, they tended to mean working for them for free as domestic or agricultural laborers. And so finally, at these institutions, the death rates in some places were as high as 30% annually, meaning 30% of the people who entered the poorhouse died every year. So quite literally, people were taking their lives in their own hands when they entered the poorhouse. The Kings County Poor Farm, by the way, was at 6737 Corson Ave at Willow Street, where the South Seattle College Georgetown campus is today. It was built in 1877, became the Providence Hospital, and lasted, it became sort of a convalescent home in the 1930s and was knocked down and demolished in 1956. The poorhouse that I've been able to find that was open the longest so far in my touring was actually in Kansas City, where it was open until 1973. So I use the metaphor of the digital poorhouse in my book to illustrate what I think of as the deep social programming of today's big data and digital tools in social services. So at their heart is this decision that we made in the 1820s that public services should act more as moral thermometers, deciding whether or not you deserve support, whether or not your poverty is your own fault, whether or not you're a moral person, rather than serving as universal floors under us all. So that's the sort of, I think, the important historical framework that you need to understand in order to start to understand these tools. But I also really want to talk about this political moment, right? Because this political moment is pretty intense and pretty interesting. And I don't think that it is necessarily intentional that these tools have become popular at this time, but I also don't think it is a mistake or random. I believe that these sort of high-tech tools for establishing eligibility, for predicting behavior, for measuring effectiveness of programs have risen to prominence right now for sort of three big reasons. The first is that they rationalize and recreate a politics of austerity, this idea that there's not enough. The second is that while they promise to address bias in frontline decision-making, they actually just hide it. And third, that I believe they act to create a kind of empathy override that eases the emotional burden of making inhumanly difficult decisions about who among America's 43 million poor people deserves support. So let's go through those one at a time. The first is that the digital poorhouse assumes austerity. And because it assumes austerity, it recreates it. So, for example, I dedicate the book to a severely disabled little girl named Sophie Stipes. And so when Sophie was 6, she received a letter from the state of Indiana that explained to her that she would be losing her Medicaid because she had failed to cooperate in establishing eligibility for the program. And this happened just as she was gaining weight, thanks to a life-saving feeding tube and learning to walk for the first time. So the Stipes family from Tipton, Indiana, was caught up in an attempt to automate and privatize all of the eligibility processes for the welfare programs of the state of Indiana. So in 2006, then Governor Mitch Daniels signed what was eventually a $1.34 billion, with a B, billion-dollar contract with this consortium of high-tech companies that included IBM and ACS, or Affiliated Computer Systems. The idea was to create a system that replaced the hands-on work of local caseworkers with online applications and regional call centers. So what that looked like from the front lines was, from caseworkers' point of view, it shifted them from their local offices, where they had been public employees, to a private contract with a private company in a regional call center, sometimes 100 or more miles away from where they actually lived. And rather than responding to a docket of families whose cases they saw from the beginning to the end, they were responding instead to a list of tasks that dropped into a queue on their computerized workflow management system. From the point of view of recipients or applicants, on the other hand, it felt like No one was actually responsible for your case from beginning to end, and when something went wrong, it was impossible to know who was responsible and accountable for fixing the problem. So the result was 1 million benefit denials in the first 3 years of the experiment. Most of them were for failure to cooperate, which basically just meant that someone somewhere in the process made a mistake. The applicant could have forgotten, the signature that was on page 34 of this 50-page form. It could have been the caseworker in the regional call center who was misapplying policy. It could have been a technical failure, that the document center scanned your driver's license in upside down. Any one of those reasons could lead to failure to cooperate, because the newly rigid system understood any kind of mistake or any kind of lapse in the application process as a potentially criminal act, right? It's really important to remember that welfare fraud is a felony, can be a felony. So this created enormous hardship for poor and working families, and I just want to introduce you to one of the people I write about in the chapter, and this is Omega Young of Evansville. So in the fall of 2008, Omega Young of Evansville missed an appointment to recertify for Medicaid because she was in the hospital suffering from terminal cancer. The cancer that began in her ovaries spread to her kidneys, breast, and liver. Her chemotherapy left her weak and emaciated. Young, a round-faced, umber-skinned mother of 2 grown sons, struggled to meet the new system's requirements. Though she called her county help center to let them know that she was hospitalized and couldn't make the call, her medical benefits and food stamps were still cut off for failure to cooperate. Because she lost her benefits, she was unable to afford her medications, she lost her food stamps, she struggled to pay her rent, and she lost access to free transportation to medical appointments. And Omega Young died on March 1st, 2009. On the next day, on March 2nd, she won an appeal for wrongful termination, and all of her benefits were restored. Okay, so let's take a minute with Omega's story before I move on. So every one of the administrators who talk about these tools, or the policymakers who choose to use them, will often talk about them as ways to increase efficiency or cost savings. And this is why I think it's really important to understand this work in the context of austerity. But the other thing that they talk about most commonly is as using these tools as ways to reduce or remove bias. So I want to talk a little bit about bias. And to talk about bias, I want to talk about a tool called the Allegheny Family Screening Tool, which is a statistical model that's supposed to be able to predict which children might be victims of abuse or neglect in the future in Allegheny County, which is the county where Pittsburgh is in Pennsylvania. And I want to start this, actually, by introducing you to a family rather than doing it the other way around. So in Allegheny County, one of the many families I spoke to were Angel Shepard and Patrick Grebe. And I met them at the Duquesne Family Support Center, which is a sort of a community hub where child welfare involved parents sort of attend programs, access resources, do peer support. And Angel and Patrick didn't stand out to me right away because their experience is so utterly average, so characteristic of the routine, mundane indignities that are experienced by the white working class. So they've struggled with low-wage, dangerous work, poor quality public schools, and predatory online education, poor health, and community violence. But through it all, Patrick and Angel have remained really creative, involved parents. So they're helping to care for both their own daughter, or Angel's daughter, Harriet, and Patrick's daughter's daughter, Desiree. And the 2 girls are sort of roughly the same age, so they bicker a lot. And one of the ways that they solve the bickering problem is this thing they call the get-along shirt. And the get-along shirt, so Patrick is this sort of wall of a man. In the book, I call him a sort of a Buddhist ex-biker because he has like extensive and elaborate facial hair, and he's just a big old square of a human being. He's this very big, like very gentle man. And so what they do is they take one of his button-down shirts, this sort of enormous button-down shirt, and they require each girl to put one arm through the armhole of the shirt and one arm around the waist of the other girl, and they actually have to stay together in the get-along shirt until they stop fighting. even if they have to go to the bathroom. Patrick says this is what always works, that they will always stop fighting once one of them has to pee. So despite this, Angel and Patrick have racked up really a lifetime of interactions with the Office of the Agency of Children, Youth, and Family Services in Pittsburgh, which is what most states called CPS, or Child Protective Services is called CYF, in Allegheny County. So Patrick was investigated for medical neglect in the early 2000s because he was unable to afford his daughter Tabitha's antibiotic prescription after an emergency room visit, and when he brought her back the next day, the nurse who had originally treated them said, right, we know this got better, we know you didn't, we know this got worse, we know you didn't pick up your antibiotic prescription, we're gonna call CYF. When Harriet was 5, that's Angel's daughter, someone phoned in a string of reports to the Child Abuse and Neglect Hotline. This is an anonymous caller who explained that Harriet was running around the neighborhood unsupervised, that she was down the block teasing a dog, that she wasn't being properly clothed, fed, or bathed, that she wasn't getting needed medication. So for each call, an investigator came out to the house, interviewed Harriet and Tabitha, Angel and Patrick, looked in all the cupboards and under all the beds, and requested access to the family's medical records. And then each time, finding no evidence of maltreatment, they closed the case. But each of these interactions is entered into the family's case file, which is held in an integrated data warehouse, which feeds the Allegheny Family Screening Tool. I'm going to explain how that tool works in just a second, so let me just put a pin in that. The upshot, though, of what Patrick and Angel told me is that they live in a kind of a state of low-grade terror, that because they've interacted with the system so much in the past, their fear is that the screening tool will rate them as a risk to their children. And then if there's another call on their family, the algorithm will target their daughter or granddaughter for investigation and potentially for removal to foster care. So Angel said to me, you feel like a prisoner. You feel trapped. It's like no matter what you do, it's not good enough for them. My daughter is now 9, and I'm still afraid they're going to come up one day, see her out by herself, pick her up, and say, you can't have her anymore. So the Allegheny Family Screening Tool is built on top of an integrated data warehouse that was built by the county in 1999. And the data warehouse currently, or as of the writing of the book at the end of 2017, held 1 billion records, more than 800 for every individual in Allegheny County. But of course, data isn't collected equally on every single person in Allegheny County. So data extracts are basically connected from services that really only serve poor and working class communities, or that are disproportionately active in poor and working class communities. So data extracts are regularly collected from adult and juvenile probation, the jails and prisons, county mental health services, the State Office of Income Maintenance, which is sort of Pennsylvania's welfare system, the public schools, and other agencies that primarily serve poor and working class people. So the limits of that data actually shape what this model that is built on top of it is able to predict. So it relies almost entirely on information that is only collected on families who reach out to public assistance programs for help. So professional middle class families also need help with their child raising and parenting duties. But because they reach out to, say, a nanny or a babysitter for child support, or they reach out to their family doctor for help with an addiction or a mental health problem, and they pay for it with private insurance, that information never goes in the data warehouse. Because it never goes in the data warehouse, that means the model is only able to predict, is only able to see the kinds of harm that happen in poor and working class communities. So not only is that a problem in terms of false positives, so that was mostly the parents' concern, was that this model would see harm where no harm was actually occurring, but it's also a problem for false negatives, meaning not seeing harm where harm might be occurring. So that was the concern of intake call screeners who I spoke to, was that since the data is only collected on poor and working class people, it doesn't have variables available about the behavior of professional middle class families, which means that the model actually can't predict the kind of harm that happens in their communities. The model's designers and the administrators say that part of the purpose of this system is to root out bias and intake call screener decision making. So these are the folks who pick up the phone if a call is made to a county hotline for abuse or neglect, or when a report is made by a mandated reporter, someone who's required by law to report any suspicion they have that abuse or neglect might be occurring in these families. So the idea here was, part of the idea was to be able to collect data on the decision-making of these intake call screeners to identify patterns of bias and sort of irrational decision-making. But the model doesn't actually remove discretion, it simply moves it, right? So I have a very smart political scientist friend named Joe Sauce, and he says discretion is like energy. It's never created or destroyed, it's simply moved. So in Allegheny County, the model actually moves discretion from frontline caseworkers, who are the most working class, the most female, and the most diverse part of the social service workforce, and moves it instead to the economists and data scientists who are building the models. So part of the problem is those folks who are designing the models really only address bias in a very specific way, that it's a property of individuals and that it is a result of irrational thinking. So it's, they're good at identifying bias that is the fault of individuals who are holding misapprehensions, but they're not terribly good at identifying or addressing structural bias. And of course, inequity is systemic and structural. So for example, an example of how this works in Allegheny County is the county's own research shows that they have a serious issue with racial disproportionality in Allegheny County. 38% of children in foster care in Allegheny County are black and African, black and biracial. And only 18% of the youth in the county are black and biracial. But the county's own research shows that the great majority of that disproportionality does not enter the system at call screening. It enters the system at the point at which the community calls the hotline or mandated reporters report on families. And that isn't necessarily a data solution amenable problem. That is a cultural problem. In these deeply held shared beliefs about what a good family looks like and about which parents are dangerous or risky to their children. In Allegheny County, black and biracial families are 3.5 times more likely to be called on than white families. Once it gets to the point of intake screeners, black and biracial families are screened in 69% of the time, and white families are only screened in 64% of the time. So there is a tiny bit of disproportion that's entering at screening, but the great majority of it is happening actually at the point at which people call on families. And so one of the great and I think terrifying ironies of these systems is you're actually removing intake worker discretion at a point where it could potentially override community bias, which could create a system that amplifies and intensifies bias, right? Yeah, period. I was about to go down a technical black hole. I'm happy to talk about proxies with people, and there's a great conversation to be had about proxies, but we're already 20 minutes in, so we're gonna skip it. Oh, no, we're gonna keep it here. It's a beautiful slide. I'll explain it later. Okay, so one of my greatest fears around these systems is that they potentially serve as empathy overrides, meaning they outsource to computers some of the most difficult decisions we face as a community. So just as an example, the second case I write about in the book, and this is something that I think will be particularly interesting to you all in Seattle, because I know you're embarking on this sort of interesting project of engaging the technology community in the crisis, the housing crisis So this is, I think, a case that'll be particularly interesting for folks. So I explore a system in Los Angeles called the Coordinated Entry System. The Coordinated Entry System is common across the country and even in other places, but Los Angeles is a really interesting place to look at it because Los Angeles, as of the last point in time count, has 58,000 unhoused people in the county. It's the second highest in the US. And one of the things that makes their housing crisis particularly acute is something like 75% of homeless people in Los Angeles County are completely unsheltered, meaning they have no access to emergency shelter. They have no access to shelter of any kind. They're living on the street. They're living in cars. So the system, the Coordinated Entry System, works in Los Angeles. There's basically sort of 4 pieces. The first is this very intensive survey called the, with a terrible acronym, called the VI-SPDAT. The VI-SPDAT stands for Vulnerability Index and Service Prioritization Decision Assistance Tool. Not my first time saying that out loud. The VI-SPDAT is this very intensive survey that unhoused people complete that is supposed to identify how vulnerable they are to some of the worst outcomes of homelessness, including death, emergency room visits, mental health crisis, and violence. After the VI-SPDAT is filled out, that information goes into another acronym system, the HMIS, the Homeless Management Information System. Technical rabbit hole over there that we're not going to go down. Happy to talk to HMIS for people who are about HMIS for people who are interested later. Once it gets into HMIS, there's an algorithm that scores each person on a scale of vulnerability from 0 being lowest to 17 being highest. And at the same time, information about housing opportunities is entering the other end of the pipeline. And in the middle of the pipeline, there is supposedly an algorithm that matches the most vulnerable unhoused people to the most appropriate available housing resource. Now, it's actually interesting to note that there is no actual second algorithm. That's what's called a mechanical Turk, right? That there's like actually a human being in a box in the middle of the process that's supposed to be an algorithm. It's actually just a guy in a room who matches. That's not even in the book, so you guys have a big secret. Yeah, so they never got that algorithm to work. And now the Coordinated Entry System actually serves folks at the top of the scale, the very critically vulnerable unhoused folks pretty well. It also serves those at the bottom who require the fewest resources pretty well. But then there are 30,000 people. So they've managed to survey 39,000 people, unhoused people, and they've managed to serve about 9,000 of them with resources. So one of the questions I had about the system is what happens to those 30,000 folks who have done this very intensive survey and get no resources? How do they feel about the system? And so one of the folks I talked to about that was a guy who goes by the nickname of Uncle Gary. His name is Gary Boatwright. And when I met him, he had been living in a gray and green tent on East 6th on the edge of Skid Row for many years. He's a straight-talking, wryly funny man with thinning white hair and Santa Claus blue eyes. He's had a dozen careers. He was a welder, a mason, a paralegal, a door-to-door salesman, a law student, and most recently he was a document processor for a wholesale mortgage lender. And this actually has like an enormous number of ironies to it because it was one of the subprime mortgage lenders who helped create the 2008 financial crisis, which in part made the housing crisis in Los Angeles quite a bit worse. So since moving to Skid Row from Orange County, Gary's filled out the VI-SPDAT at least 3 times, and by the time I talked to him, he had really lost patience with the process. He doesn't think he scored very high on the vulnerability scale. He's only 64, and other than a little high blood pressure and a hearing problem, he's mostly healthy. Though he's known by some as Commander Kush and keeps a rum, rum in a bottle of a Mountain Dew bottle in his tent, his substance use, at least to me, didn't seem abusive or debilitating. He has a mental health file in Orange County. He doesn't actually know what's in it. He only found out that he had one when he was in court, and no one's ever shared his diagnosis with him. So the problem, as he sees it, though, is not his comparative vulnerability or his risk score. It's simple math. There's not enough housing in Los Angeles for the county's 58,000 unhoused people. And so he said to me, people like me who are somewhat higher functioning, we're not getting housing. It's another way of kicking the can down the road. In order to house the homeless, you have to have available units. Show me the units. Otherwise, you're just lying. So in November 2016, as I was finishing the draft of the book, Gary was arrested, and he was charged with breaking the window of a public bus with a plastic 99-cent store broom, which, when he called me from Men's Central, he said is, quote, physically impossible. When he got out about a year ago, he had lost everything, his tent, his paperwork, his relationship with local organizations and networks of friends. And if he chooses to engage with coordinated entry again, he will score lower on the VI SPDAT because it counts incarceration as being housed. So the model will see him as less vulnerable, and his priority score will slip even further. So my concern with a system like coordinated entry is that by acting as this empathy override, right? Like I spoke a lot to frontline caseworkers. I have a huge amount of empathy for homeless service workers who see 100 people a day and only have resources to serve 2 of them. Right? I don't want to be making those decisions. They shouldn't be left with the responsibility of making those decisions. But the solution is not to then outsource those decisions to computers. So my concern is by acting as relief valves for this huge shared collective problem, which is the housing crisis in the United States, right? There's not enough low-income housing in any county in the United States right now. Not a single county has adequate low-income housing. The fear is, by acting as empathy overrides, these tools really radically limit our political vision, and they absolve us of the responsibility we have to care for each other. So I think one of the things that's really important to understand is that good intentions can lead to bad outcomes. And I can hear skeptics now about the book, right? Scary stories sell books. Virginia, you cherry-picked the most frightening cases, like the scariest systems you can find. But the reality is, well, okay, so Indiana's pretty bad. I don't know what was in Governor Daniels' heart, right? I don't know what was in his soul. But it's easy to believe that there was intention to kick people off of public assistance there. And in fact, one of the folks I spoke to at length in Indiana, this Medicaid attorney named Chris Hawley, said, you know, if they had tried to build a system to kick people off of public benefits, I don't see it working any better than the system that we got. But I think while we could maybe make an argument that this was a case of bad intention, bad design, bad implementation, bad outcomes, I don't actually think that's the interesting question. The interesting question is not, are designers, do they mean to be awful, right? That's not the interesting question. And that's why I chose the Los Angeles and Allegheny County cases. Because in those cases, the designers, the administrators, the caseworkers I spoke to were all very bright, very well-intentioned people who cared deeply about the well-being of the folks their agencies serve. And in both of those places, designers have actually done almost everything that progressive critics of algorithmic decision-making ask them to do. So what we tend to ask folks to do is be transparent, let us see how the system works, be accountable, hold the system in a public agency so that there's some kind of democratic control over it, and maybe like on the outside edge of progressive critique, we'll ask folks to do some kind of participatory or human-centered design. In both Allegheny County and Los Angeles, they've done all 3 of those things. So these are, in fact, some of the best systems we have, not some of the worst. So here's the sort of challenging question. What if the problem with the coming age of artificial intelligence and machine learning and social services is not that the systems are broken, but rather that the systems carry out the imperative to limit access to resources and police the behavior of the poor too well? What if they're not mistakes or intention, but they are sort of natural amplifiers and intensifiers of the inequity we already have in our society today. So all of the designers for all three of the systems I study in the book share or like agree on one thing. So they say sort of data analytics, matching algorithms, automated decision making are, they'd say sort of regrettable but necessary systems for triage, for deciding whose life is immediately threatened by economic inequality and who can wait. But the decision to triage at all is actually a political choice, right? So $2 a day poverty, homelessness, child neglect are not natural disasters. They're created by structural exploitation and bad policy. Triage is only appropriate language if there are more resources forthcoming. If there are no resources forthcoming, what we're doing is not actually triage, it's rationing, right? And we need to call it what it is, which is automating rationing. And we can do better than that. We deserve better than that. And I wrote this book because I think we deserve better, our people deserve better, our communities deserve better. I think the fundamental danger of the digital poorhouse is that it demands that we think small, that we work within these sort of arbitrarily imposed limits, both to our resources and to our political imagination. But in this political moment, and justice itself, it really demands that we think big, that we push back against austerity fever. Right, so what do we do? What are the solutions? I believe that there's sort of three big things that need to happen at the same time, and I'm sorry, because I really know that often when I'm in rooms talking about the book, what people most want is like a 5-point plan for building better technology. And I mean, I'd love to give you that, but I don't actually think that that's the solution to the problems we face. So I think we actually have to do cultural, political, and technical work at the same time. I think the first step is really changing the story we tell about poverty in the United States, specifically the story about who is poor. So we have a story in the US that says that poverty is an aberration, that it only happens to a small minority of probably pathological people, but this is simply untrue. So based on Mark Rank's really generative life course research on poverty in the US, it's clear that 51% of us will be below the poverty line at some point in our adult lives. That's between 20 and 64. And that nearly 2/3 of us, 65% of us, will access means-tested public assistance. So that's not reduced price school lunches, that's not Social Security, that's straight welfare. And so this idea, this political idea that our social service system has to be a moral thermometer, it has to decide who is pathological and who is deserving of help, makes absolutely no sense, right? If poverty is a majority issue, then moral diagnosis is simply a completely illegitimate solution to that problem. So I believe the second kind of change that needs to happen is shifting the politics away from these means-tested punitive programs that spend so much of their effort, so many of their resources deciding who's deserving, and shifting instead to an approach based in universal human rights. So we need to decide as a country that there's a line below which no one is allowed to go for any reason, that there is no behavior that means that you deserve to go hungry, that no one in the United States deserves to live in a tent on a sidewalk for a decade, that no family in the US is split up because parents can't afford a child's medication. So in other places around the world, these conditions would be considered human rights violations. And here we think of them as systems engineering problems. And that should give us deep, deep pause about the state of our national soul, about who we are as a people, and about our commitment to ending economic and social inequity. That said, those two things are a lot of work. And in the meantime, technology is not going to just stop while we get the cultural and political stories worked out. So my third set of solutions is about refusing to design technologies in neutral. So designing objective systems actually means designing for the status quo, right? So to sort of rephrase Paulo Freire on education, he says education Neutral education is education for the status quo. In the same way, neutral technology design is design for the status quo. And because these technologies scale so quickly, because they work so fast, because there are higher barriers to understanding them, they have the potential to vastly amplify and intensify inequality. So I usually use the metaphor of like designing a car without gears or without a steering wheel in a place like San Francisco, and then being surprised when the car crashes at the bottom of a hill or a twist or a turn, right? We live in a landscape that is deeply beset and riven by inequality. If we build our tools without gears for actually addressing those inequalities, and what I mean by that is building tools that that address inequity on purpose every time. It means that we should not be surprised when those neutral tools sort of crash into the landscape of inequality that we have in the United States. This means designing new technologies with all of our values in mind. Efficiency and cost savings are important, of course, but they also have to be balanced with other collective goals. So self-determination, dignity, fairness, due process, equity. So if we're to have a more just future, we have to build it on purpose, brick by brick, and bite by bite. If we outsource our moral responsibility to care for each other to computers, we have no one but ourselves to blame when these systems supercharge discrimination and automate austerity. I thank you so much for your attention. And what I'm going to explain just quickly, that what we're going to do, I believe, is move directly into the panel, and we're going to have a little conversation, and then we're going to leave a lot of space for questions. So if I know you probably are eager to ask questions, maybe just write them down, and we promise we'll leave lots of time for it. So thank you guys so much for listening.